This is Radhika Desai. Dr. Desai is a professor in Department of Political Studies at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. She's the author of many articles and many books. I think one of the most foundational ones in the field is the 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy After U.S. Hegemony, Globalization and Empire. I just started reading her work last year, actually, and I've been constantly recommending it to my colleagues and comrades since, because it's very serious and solid, but also politically relevant and helpful. And all of this in a field that is, I think, even more hostile to revolutionary Marxism than all the other fields. But in addition to the sort of scholarship, she's the director of the Geopolitical Economy Research Group. And she most recently convened the International Manifesto Group, which has produced a collectively written manifesto titled Through Pluripolarity to Socialism, which brought together really an impressive array of international intellectuals and activists that represent diverse trends within the socialist movement. And actually next month, we're just finalizing a webinar that's going to happen March 26th with the International Manifesto Groups, the Geopolitical Economy Research Group, and some others that is going to be titled Clarifying the Struggle for Socialism on the Uses and Misuses of Marxist Capital, which should be publicized soon. So it'd be very great if everybody here could be part of that. And I'm hoping that when Radhika speaks, maybe she can speak a bit more about the manifesto, how people can read it, sign it, share it, and get involved in the project. She's got just such a deep, broad, and nuanced body of knowledge on Marxist political economy. And I'm particularly interested in her work on Marxism and the nation. But she also knows a lot about the reproduction schemas and the debates around them, which is something I don't know that much about. So I'm really, really happy that she's here to talk to us about this. And yeah, please help me welcome Radhika.
Thanks, folks. And I'm just pasting the International Manifesto Group URL here. And yeah, let me just jump right into the talk because the time is limited and let's see how far we can get. And Derek, if you feel that you want to stop me in order to get into a discussion, please don't hesitate if I drone on for too long. So I'm just going to share my screen. Can I do that? I think I can. Yeah. Right, so I just put together some notes. I may sort of go away from these, but basically what I want to talk about is how and why Volume 2 is really quite massively misunderstood. So here goes. So basically in outline, I want to make a few introductory remarks. Then I want to talk about what I really think Volume 2 is about and why it is so fundamentally misinterpreted, particularly in Western Marxism and why it matters. And then we'll look at what Marx really says on the question of demand, because the misunderstanding and misinterpretation revolves around the critical role of demand. Because essentially the people who misinterpret Volume 2 basically claim in one guise or another, obviously without ever saying that they actually endorse Say's law, they actually endorse Say's law. And the particular form that it takes in Marxism is that essentially you don't have to worry about consumption demand. Doesn't matter if workers don't consume anything because Department 1 can keep producing producers' goods, and that will somehow be quite enough. And there has to be no final demand, which is a really absurd argument if you think about it, but we will discuss how and why this came about. And then finally, I'll say a few things about how Rosa Luxemburg, I think, was on the absolute, her interpretation of Volume 2 is often criticized, but I think that she is fundamentally correct in her interpretation, and I'll explain why. And yeah, I think that will be about what I'm going to say. So in terms of my introductory remarks, I would just want to say that little of what I have to say will be totally comprehensible without knowing two things. One, that I have argued in my geopolitical economy that nations are as material a result of the development of capitalism as are classes. That is to say, nations are not they do not occur because, you speak English and I speak Gujarati and somebody else speaks French, etc., or they have different religions or what have you. They are a direct result of the unfolding of capitalism and what Trotsky called the uneven and combined development of capitalism. And secondly, that over the decades, my study of Capital and Marx's other writings, in the course of this, I've become very critical of the intellectual formation known as Marxist economics, which forms the core, I would say, of Western Marxism. I'm not critical of all of it. I'm not critical necessarily of individuals. I know that I would share many concerns and preoccupations and political principles with them, but I am critical of the intellectual dead ends to which it leads. I'm critical of the systematic misinterpretation of Marx to which it has led. And the writings in which I have developed these views, and I'll send these around if you're interested. All of these are links to the official publications, and sometimes you can get the full text, but if you can't, I'll be happy to send them to you. But in 2010, I wrote an article, a very long one, called Consumption Demand in Marx and in the Current Crisis, which was directed against the widespread prejudice that Marx did not think that consumption demand was a problem, and that to think so was to be under-consumptionist. In 2015 or 16, I wrote The Value of History and the History of Value, which further developed the idea of historicizing our understanding of capitalism in much the way that I think Marx's Capital is historical. I believe somewhere David Harvey says that there is no history in Capital. There is nothing, there's never been a false statement ever. And I don't see how he has gone on preaching about capitalism, etc., in his allegedly very widely, very popular videos. I don't get what he's saying. Anyway, if you think that, you don't get Marx, basically. And in which I argue, by the way, also that capitalism is historical in a dual sense. It's not just a historically specific mode of production, but it has its own history. And it is the contradictions of value production, the contradictions of capitalism, that form the driving motor of that history. I wrote a very short piece in Red Pepper, which was supposed to be a review of Capital at its 150th anniversary. Oh, sorry, I mistyped it. Yeah, no, I didn't mistype it. History. It was originally titled History in Capital and Capital in History. I also wrote a piece for the Bloomsbury Companion to Marx, in which I talked about where political economy was when Marx essentially went to it in order to understand the dynamics of capitalism. What were its outstanding conundrums and antinomies that Marx resolved in his fantastic and brilliant way. And finally, I wrote a piece most recently, I think 2 years ago, on Marxist critical economy, in which I also, in a more granular fashion, show how Western Marxism, both wings of Western Marxism, the New Left Review, Brennerite political Marxism wing, and the Monthly Review, Sweezyite wing, are both in their own way misinterpret Marx and so on. So what do I call?
I did upload that one to the chat, as well as two of the ones on the materiality of nations, just so you know.
Great, thank you. Yeah. So, what do I understand by Marxist economics? It's very important to understand that the emergence of neoclassical economics forms a profound discontinuity in the evolution of economic thought. When you take Economics 101, you are taught economic thought from Adam Smith to, I don't know, Larry Summers and Paul Krugman and whoever else comes next. But this is a false history. The emergence of neoclassical economics separates the pre-existing tradition of classical political economy, which culminates in Marx. Marx is the critical culmination of classical political economy. And then precisely because classical political economy, including various of Ricardo's notions, are leading to radical politics, and the working class is getting organized, you get essentially the counter-revolution, the intellectual counter-revolution represented by neoclassical economics. You'd have thought that Marxists would have fought tooth and nail against neoclassical economics, but they did not. In the economic theory of the leisure class, Bukharin complains that most Marxists are adopting a policy of theoretical reconciliation towards neoclassical economics. Why does this happen? As far as my understanding goes, it's partly because by this time, neoclassical economics has become so embedded in the academic system that basically, or anybody who is half educated comes to Marxism having their heads already filled with neoclassical economics. So they actually cannot comprehend what Marx is talking about. Secondly, of course, this is Western Marxism. And so the favored position of Western countries in the larger imperial system also gives a certain reformist bent to their working class movements, and we can discuss this further. The result is a fundamental misunderstanding of Marx's analysis of capitalism as involving necessarily contradictory value production. So out of this type of Marxist economics that emerges from the policy of theoretical reconciliation, there are three major claims that emerge. One, Marx's value analysis suffers from a transformation problem. Marx is not able to essentially transform values into prices. And as I have shown in this piece called Political Economy, this was not Marx's problem, it was Ricardo's problem. Marx solved that problem. But because so many Marxists are actually Ricardians more than they are Marxists, they cannot understand this. Okay. Secondly, they claim that, and this also comes from Ricardian Marxism, they claim that Marx did not think demand or the paucity of demand was a problem in capitalism. Nothing could be less true. And this piece here, the consumption demand piece, it shows just how pervasive Marx in Grundrisse, in volume 1, in volume 2, in volume 3, they are replete with discussions of how critical and fundamental is the contradiction that the socialized production and private appropriation give rise to systematically to a paucity of demand. And finally, they claim that Marx was wrong about falling profits, a claim that I also refute here in the same article. That is to say, Marx's idea that there was a tendency of the rate of profit to fall was wrong. It's complete rubbish. Okay, and so so what you have is a Marxist economics that essentially argues, although they claim they're Marxist, ironically they're arguing that Marx was wrong, and that we are going to write Marx. And this has become an entire academic industry. I'm sorry to tell you, but that's the way it is. Again, I'm not criticizing the motivations of individual Marxist economists, but they are all caught in the same trap, and they have very little reason to question the direction in which they're going, because it's very convenient. It's very, very convenient. Because, you know, how useful is a Marxist in a neoliberal academic establishment who says Marx was wrong? Of course, he's absolutely useful. Okay, so my view is that you have to read Marx, and when you read Marx, just read Marx directly. Don't listen to people who say Marx is hard. He's not hard. All you have to do, the only thing that makes it hard is when you take your neoclassical economics 101 lenses in there, park them at the door, look at what Marx is really saying, understand that what you were taught about economics is actually complete rubbish. Let me just give you a small example. You're always told that the one thing that neoclassical economics gets right is it understands price formation. Anyone who is a serious economist will tell you that the neoclassical theory of price formation is totally false. Prices are not formed by the interaction of demand and supply. They are pre-existing on the basis of costs of production, much as Marx said. But anyway, that's just to give you one example. So before proceeding further, let me dispatch one important irony about neoclassical economics. It posits a self-regulating market order which could exist anywhere at any time as a system of provision of human needs. Yeah, it tells you that this system exists and it is just the perfect system for provisioning human needs. In this form, it has catalyzed the socialist calculation debate and later discussions of welfare and planning, because you see the earliest discussions of planning arise from a way of trying to understand neoclassical theory, but adapting it to the needs of planning. However, precisely for that reason, it could only fail to penetrate the one historical form of social production that is the farthest thing in human history from a system for provisioning human needs, that is capitalism. That is to say, oddly enough, neoclassical economics is more helpful when you are trying to think of a real system of provisioning human needs, namely socialism, and it is a total failure at trying to understand capitalism. Okay, so what's the deal with volume 2? So as you have already now seen, I really like the bits that I heard. I think they're broadly correct about volume 2. So you are volume 2 has to be understood as the volume that's trying to understand the process of circulation, and specifically capitalist circulation. Now here, I should just say, I add as an aside that there are some interesting debates about whether you can have commodity production which is not capitalist, and whether commodity production that was not capitalist has ever existed. I think the answer to this is a bit complex, so I won't go into it, but I just want to signal that there is this whole debate here. So, because it's about circulation, it's particularly easy prey for Marxist economics, and it's proof that for Marx, demand was not a problem. So they look at all these reproduction schemas and says, you see, these schemas all work. There is no demand problem in these schemas. There is no demand problem in Marx. Voila, Marx, there is no demand problem according to Marx. So this is so even though volume 1, so they argue these things, even though volume 1 contains the great refutation of Say's law in the chapter on money. Okay, it's not in the chapter on exploiting, it's in the chapter on money, because the way in which the paucity of demand emerges is precise. It wouldn't emerge if we didn't live in a money economy, if capitalism did not require a money economy. So it's very good that it's in that space. And by the way, Keynes had a very similar critique of Say's law as well. So volume 1 does that, and volume 3 clearly states in as many words the ultimate reason for all real crises remains the poverty and restricted consumption of the working classes. All the references, that, by the way, are to the Penguin editions. So why does this matter? It matters because Western Marxism portrays capitalism as being only about class. It ignores imperialism, which is the domination of one nation over the other. And I can give you loads of quotes of Marx, where Marx says, I think somewhere in his writings on free trade, Marx says, since these gentlemen, these people who he is criticizing, do not understand how one nation can exploit another, no wonder they cannot understand how one class can exploit another. For him, he puts the two side by side as equally important and analogous. So that's very, very important. And for this is very important. So anyway, further, therefore, it ignores anti-imperialist resistance and the necessity of anti-imperialist resistance. It ignores, therefore, the centrality of the latter in building socialism. I would argue that certainly in the Chinese case, but also in the Soviet case, anti-imperialism was just as important a motivation as was the desire to build a more equal, just, prosperous society, namely some kind of socialist class politics. So to me, you cannot understand these revolutions unless you understand the workings of imperialism. So Western Marxism further, as a result of this kind of orientation, discounts actually existing imperialism's role in creating the wealth of the imperialist nations and the poverty of the imperialized ones. The result is therefore to attribute a Promethean productivity to capitalism. Capitalism is amazingly productive. It is, we have to let it finish its work. Only then we can make socialist revolution, which means, especially in this day and age when capitalism is doing everything but produce anything, we will wait forever for it to solve the production problem. So, they attribute this, and so I call this a Schumpeterian rather than a Marxist understanding of capitalism. Further, it neglects the necessity to organize production for socialism in Western countries. So if you look at practically every left-wing force, including forces that call themselves Marxist, on the whole, their focus is on redistributing a wealth that is supposedly already created by capitalism, but it's not created by capitalism. And as I say, capitalism is failing now more than ever before to produce anything. So you are going to have to think about organizing production and organizing planned production, which means no possibility of what I call Proudhonist economics, where, you know, some kind of a sea of cooperatives and worker managed companies and so on are going to solve all the problems. You have to be thinking about how you're going to organize centralized planning. And if you're worried about democracy, as you should be, you're going to have to think about how this is going to take place on as democratic a basis as possible. There is no how can I say, neglecting this is about as anti-socialist as you can get. So this is why it matters. So now let's see what Marx actually says in volume 2. So in volume 2, Marx specifically treats the circulation of capital and its realization. So it's all about circulation. How does, in going from M to M dash, or what are the different circulation stages that capital has to go through? So although his main focus is on demonstrating that realization is possible, he is not emphasizing the difficulty of it. He's just showing that if it's going to work like this. But at the same time, he nevertheless registers the difficulty of doing this. So he says on this page here that I've referenced, the maximum limit of the capitalist demand is C equals, I've got the signs wrong, C equals C plus V. But his supply is C plus V plus S. The greater the percentage of S produced, the rate of profit, the smaller his demand is in relation to his supply. Although as production advances, the capitalist's demand for labor power and hence indirectly for the necessary means of subsistence becomes progressively smaller than his demand for the means of production, it should not be forgotten that his demand for the means of production is always smaller than his capital, considering this day by day. So what he's saying here is that there will always be a gap between what is supplied and what is demanded. And that gap is accounted for by the portion of the total value produced that goes to the capitalist, it's accounted for because capitalists can never be entirely relied on to spend it. Further, he also in volume 2, Marx also emphasizes the importance of workers as consumers. Marx goes on to add that many capitalists are involved here, not just one. That many capitalists are involved, not just one, in no way affects the matter, clearly dismissing the argument that capitalists buying producer goods from one another is the solution. Nor does he dismiss the role of foreign trade in alleviating overproduction, both in Department 1 and Department 2, remarking that this only shifts the contradictions onto a broader sphere and gives them a wider orbit. However, the problems created by the limits on workers' demand are noted only in a footnote and postponed once again to a proper discussion in a later volume. Now, you have to remember when reading all these volumes, the 3 volumes that we have are still a small fraction. They are not even half of what Marx planned to write in his Capital, right? It was a multi-volume work. Anyway, the footnote says this: the workers are important for the market as buyers of commodities, but as sellers of their commodity, namely labor power, capitalist society has the tendency to restrict them to their minimum price. The periods in which capitalist production exerts all its forces, so it is most dynamic, regularly show themselves to be periods of overproduction, because the limit to the application of the productive powers is not simply the production of value, but also its realization. However, the sale of commodities, the realization of commodity capital, and thus of surplus value as well, is restricted not by the consumer needs of society, in general, but by consumer needs of a society in which the great majority are always poor and must remain poor. So their demand must always fall short of what is needed. So Mandel, in his introduction, which I very much urge you to read, it's Mandel's introduction to all 3 volumes are really great. Although in this one, I have to say, I think he's a little bit more critical of Luxemburg than he should be, but that's a small disagreement. Okay, so what he says here is that the basic function of the reproduction schemas is to demonstrate that growth, that is the very existence of capitalism, because capitalism is accumulate, that's Moses and the prophets. So growth is at least possible under the capitalist mode of production, given the extremely anarchic nature of the organization of production, under laissez-faire capitalism on the home market, under monopoly capitalism on the world market. By the way, this is very critical if you're going to understand Brenner's history of the world economy, but that's a separate point. And given the very nature of competition, this is by no means as obvious as it sounds. That is, it is not obvious that the reproduction schema should show that it is possible for capitalism to work. The reproduction schemas locate the combination of value and use value structures of the total commodity package within which growth can occur. These emphases are Mandel's. But Marx never sought to prove that these proportions are automatically and constantly guaranteed by the invisible hand of market forces. On the contrary, he insists again and again that these proportions are difficult to realize and are impossible to permanently retain, and that they are automatically upset by the same forces that bring them occasionally into being. In other words, the reproduction schemas show that equilibrium, not to speak of equilibrated growth, is the exception and not the rule in capitalism. And in a footnote, Mandel quotes Marx in volume 2, which attributes again the problem to the role of money, just as he does under Say's law. Sorry, so just so you know, I'm just, this is my last slide, so I'm just 2 slides away. So I just want to make a quick elaboration then. So realization, I have argued in this 2010 piece that I told you about, the consumption demand piece, that realization is as central to capitalism as production, because many of these Ricardian Marxists, they say, oh, realization is not important. The only thing that's important is production. This is not true. For Marx, the two, you cannot have value without the two. You can produce as many shoes as you like, but unless you sell them, you cannot realize the value that they contain, and therefore you cannot realize the surplus value that you have extracted from your workers in your shoe factory, right? It's as simple as that. So Marx says, sorry, this is me, but I think at various points I'm quoting Marx. It was the market, therefore, that determined whether and to what extent the various concrete labors successfully realized themselves as abstract labor. That is to say, Marx says that, you can be a shoemaker, you can be a tractor maker, you can be a shirt maker, you can be a computer maker, but unless your product is sold, your goods have not been validated by society as being necessary. So abstract labor they have not been converted into abstract labor. Until they're sold, they remain concrete labor in the production of shoes or computers or tractors or shirts. So the market translated the private into the social, the concrete into the abstract. It was only because use value and exchange value, concrete labor and exchange labor, was not immediately identical, that they require the mediation of the market, which in turn implied the possibility of crises, in Marx's words. Capital or surplus value did not arise in circulation. Marx says that in the famous passage about the worker going into the factory, with no admittance except by permission, etc. He says, capital or surplus value does not arise in circulation. Nevertheless, it is equally impossible for it to arise apart from circulation. It must have its origin both in circulation and not in circulation. So further, in distinguishing use value and value, and this, a lot of people read chapter 1 and they kind of, especially if their minds are still addled with neoclassical economics. They don't get what Marx is talking about, but really that chapter is the most fundamental, and Marx was right to put it right at the start. And we can discuss why. So in distinguishing use value and value in the first pages of Capital, Marx had meant neither to discount the first, namely use value, nor to imply that value could be self-sustaining, as in accounts which one-sidedly view capitalism as merely production for production's sake. You know, this department one rattling on without being bothered by consumption demand. Nothing can be of value that is not an object of utility. It has to be an object of utility. Otherwise, the final sale will not take place. You can make as many weaving looms as you want, but unless there is a demand for cloth, no department to capitalist is going to buy your weaving looms. That's the long and short of it. So that also has to be an object of utility. His point was rather more complex. Value is condemned to seek fulfillment as the satisfaction of individual and concrete human needs to become a use value. Without becoming a use value, without becoming your meal or your shirt or your tractor or whatever, value cannot realize itself. So it has to precipitate itself first in the form of a use value in order to finally attain the nirvana of being value. Okay. So it is condemned to seek fulfillment as the satisfaction of individual and concrete human needs, to become use value, however real or fantastical, in order to realize itself as abstract and social. So, you know, you may be fulfilling real needs like hunger, or completely unreal needs like, I don't know, the Bible, but you have to fulfill some need. As for the heroes of yore, his point, yeah, so value is condemned to seek fulfillment in this way, to become a use value. As for the heroes of yore, faced with similar missions, for the ever-growing mass of commodities let loose on the market by the grotesque Promethean productive powers of capital, there might be numerous detours in the fulfillment of this mission of realization as use value, including becoming producers' goods. But the ultimate test of human utility could never be foregone. It has to, at some point, something has to be consumed, including all the elements of fixed capital that there are. It has to be consumed and therefore found useful. In order to be sold, commodities had to have use value, whether directly as an object of consumption or indirectly as objects that are used to produce objects of consumption. If in the process of valorization, capital appears to be a value that can perform its own valorization process, an animated monster which begins to work as if its body were by love possessed, the animus that drives it is the search for realization as a use value. It has to find somebody who will buy it. Okay, so this is my last part. This concerns the whole issue of the origins of Western Marxist economics and so on. So they discount the importance of realization and they place the problems of capitalism in production alone. They also assume the expansion of the production of producers' goods to an extent and in a way that would obviate any potential for the paucity of workers' consumption to cause crisis. So their position is, it doesn't matter if workers don't consume enough, so long as there is the production of producers' goods. But they don't ask themselves, why are producers going to buy producers' goods if they cannot sell the goods produced by these producers' goods to a market? If the market is not there, why would they buy it? And my own research showed, and this I found quite interesting, because until my article was published, and certainly everybody I know who talks about it thought that all these problems originated in Bortkiewicz, but actually I showed that this goes back to the 1890s, at least, with maybe even 1880s, with Tugan Baranovsky, who was at one point a Russian legal Marxist. And I should clarify, because you may not know this, these folks were called legal Marxists because the real Marxists were persecuted. So these people did not suffer persecution, so they were called the legal Marxists, but they were considerably less radical than your Lenin or your other Marxists who were not legal. So Tugan-Baranovsky essentially originated this critique. As far as I can tell, he was the first to come forward and say, in fact, he named all the three problems that I said, that Marx's value analysis does not work, that there is no demand problem, and that profit rates do not fall. All of these three are there in Tugan-Baranovsky. And so therefore he basically sees the capitalism that is quite crisis free, except for one crisis. He says that there can be a form of disproportion between Department 1 and Department 2, which must be avoided in order that capitalism can continue functioning as an endless production of producers' goods, which is, as I say, quite astonishing. But of course, this forgets that commodity production has to be ultimately useful. Now, Tugan-Baranovsky's arguments were used and employed by people like Lenin and others in order to contest the views of the Russian populace. Some of you may know of the Narodniks, who in the late 19th century, and Marx communicated with some of them, including the famous Vera Zazulish. They had argued that capitalism could not develop in Russia because the home market was constrained. So these legal Marxist arguments were used in order to say, what rubbish you're talking about. Lenin said capitalism is already developing in Russia, and there's a whole bunch of problems associated with that. But nevertheless, Lenin made this argument on the basis of these arguments. And that's also why, in a certain sense, Lenin and others ended up accepting some of the results of what I call Marxist economics, influenced by neoclassical economics. Now, Rosa Luxemburg comes along and rightly criticizes the Lenin argument and the argument of many others like them against the Narodniks as overkill. The question, she says, whether capitalism in general and Russian capitalism in particular is capable of development. That's the question. These Marxists, however, prove this capacity, that is its capacity for development, to an extent of even offering theoretical proof that capitalism can go on without limits. And he says, one has obviously proved the unlimited capacity of capitalism to survive. And she's right, because all they have done is they have eliminated all notion of contradiction from capitalism, which is at the core of Marx's understanding. So in the accumulation of capital, which is regularly dismissed as flawed, with the appellation brilliant attached, one suspects, as a consolation prize, actually Rosa Luxemburg posed a very simple question. For successful accumulation to take place, she says, the desire to accumulate plus the technical prerequisites of accumulation is not enough in a capitalist economy of commodity production. A further condition is required to ensure that accumulation can in fact proceed and production expand. And that is, the condition is the effective demand for commodities must increase. Where is this continually increasing demand to come from? Which in Marx's diagram forms the basis of reproduction on an ever increasing scale. So here you can see that Luxemburg is slightly misinterpreting Marx's aim in volume 2, but here she's being no different, but at least her question would take us back and maybe to a re-examination of Marx's real intention in volume 2, which is to say, yes, it can just about succeed, but on the whole, this is so difficult, success is so difficult that it is generally fails to do so. So she's reposing that problem. So in this way, Luxemburg was connecting the contradictions of capitalism to imperialism, something which Western Marxist interpretation has systematically elided. They don't want to pay attention to imperialism. So we are back to the whole larger set of problems that I'm talking about. So I hope this was useful, and I think I'll end here and we can have some discussion in the time that's left.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was very, very helpful. And we didn't actually cover the last chapter, so maybe I can just sort of give a broad stroke and you can correct me and sort of add on to that. But the idea is, yeah, how does society, a capitalist society, produce enough means of production to keep producing means of production and more, for means of production and for consumer goods. And what are the, how does that, sort of like, what are the tendencies bound up with that? And I think, from my understanding, some have taken that to say that there is equilibrium possible or whatever, right? But Marx is saying that, yeah, like as you said, that it's, equilibrium can be it can happen in the same way that capital can reach an equilibrium, but only to be disrupted further. And basically what I take it to be is that, you just need, you need intensive amounts of centralized planning, because you have to produce means of production for means of production for means of production. And, that's an amazing sort of technical problem. So that's the whole thing, is like, how do these two departments not only balance each other out, but sort of meet each other's needs as they continue to grow? Is that right? And so then people say that Rosa Luxemburg looked at those and said that Marx was, do they claim that she was saying that Marx was saying there can be an equilibrium?
Is that a question for me?
Yes, that's a question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So first of all, I would say that, Rosa Luxemburg gets pilloried because at some point she said Marx was wrong. But I think saying Marx was wrong is less of a fault than actually pointing to the reality of what he was saying, which is, in the sense that insofar as she was saying Marx was wrong, it was based on a misinterpretation of Volume 2. But the realities to which she was pointing were actually already contained in Volume 2. And if she had not, because everybody was misinterpreting Volume 2, everybody was saying that Volume 2 is saying that there is no problem with equilibrium, that not only you can have equilibrium, you will have it all the time. And Marx is saying, look, if it all works out, if all these delicate processes work out in the same way that I say, then you might get equilibrium, but it will be disrupted again. And as far as the two departments are concerned, I agree with you. I think that the whole mechanism gets so much more complex, like you say, producers' goods and then department and other producers of producers' goods and so on. There are all these different connections and so on. And plus, we are forgetting the worldwide connection. So, if there is a cotton crop failure in Egypt, what's going to happen in Manchester, sort of thing. All of these connections exist. So so there are two things I want to say. So number one, equilibrium is always rare and very, very temporary. Okay, so that's the first thing. Secondly, and here is where, I wish if we had time, I would show you the chart that I've made of capitalism's crises. But anyway, perhaps some other time. But the thing is, so as a result, there can be so many different types of crises, okay? And also remember also that it's not just Department 1 and Department 2. In addition to that, there are also the relationship of various types of capitalists, your productive capitalists of Department 1, Department 2, and all the other departments. There are your commercial capitalists, there are your financial capitalists, there are et cetera, et cetera. Where was I going with this? So equilibrium is not possible. Oh, yes. So, I think one thing that I've begun to emphasize more and more, and which is definitely present in the manifesto, at least you can see a glimpse of it, because the manifesto is a very succinct presentation of a lot of things. But basically, if you look at what Marx was saying, especially if you read Volume 3, I think it's chapter 27 in Volume 3, where he talks about the socialization of production. You already see Marx, by the time he's writing this stuff, that he's already anticipating that the time has come that capitalism, back then, in late 19th century, that capitalism, by entering the monopoly phase, will have entered an era where it has finished its historic mission. What is its historic mission? Its historic mission is to socialize production. Right? So in the first competitive phase of capitalism, capital socializes production between firms, right? So you are the blacksmith, you are the potter, you are the farmer, et cetera, and there is the whole socialization of production among firms in a competitive context. The next stage is the further and deeper and far more radical socialization of production within the firm, within giant capitalist firms, okay, which are already becoming themselves massive planning devices. I don't know, some of you may have seen that there is a new book, which is, I mean, it's written in a very light vein, and I haven't read the whole thing, but so I'm not sure how, whether it's entirely adequate, but it is gesturing towards the main point, which is that today, if you look at today's big monopoly corporations, I think it's called the Republic of Walmart. In today's big monopoly what are today's big monopoly corporations? They are giant planned economies. They're giant planned economies. The CEO of Walmart can plan so intricately, thanks to modern information technology. He or she can plan so intricately that she can say, well, the lowest paid secretary is allowed to, will need X number of paper clips this year, and that's all she's allowed to buy, or he's allowed to buy. Right? So this is the level of planning that is possible. And some of you may not know this, but the Russians were very aware of it. And some of the biggest attempts to advance information and communications technology was made in the Soviet Union precisely to enable better planning, better feedback loops. So today, planning is no problem. It's already being done on a vast scale. And we can make it as democratic as we like. Right. So my point is, to go back to the question that Derek asked, already in the late 19th century, it's very clear that capitalism is kind of coming to the point where its historical utility is exhausted. We don't need it anymore. We now can take these means of production, which capitalism has developed, albeit brutally and chaotically, in order to now advance the means of production in a planned way, in a systematic way, in a surer way than is possible. Because, for example, just take the example of the Great Depression. Fordism was born before the 30 Years crisis, before the First World War. But it took the restabilization of capitalism, by the way, under the influence of many socialistic measures, before it could be generalized across the economy and yield the productivity increases that it yielded, because the anarchy of capitalist production is often antithetical to innovation, because it does not create the right conditions for innovation. I think we are now in another phase where, everybody is so fascinated by what they call technology, but actually people like Robert Gordon and others have pointed out, we are not living in an age of technological innovation that is improving our livelihoods. In fact, if anything, technological innovation is being used to control both producers and consumers ever more tightly, in a way that is not enhancing productivity, is not enhancing welfare. In fact, it is reducing it. But and of course, it is also being used by capitalist enterprises against one another. So instead of that, if we had a better economy, we would employ all this knowledge, all this technology, and much more, including, for example, renewables technology, which takes us beyond fossil fuels. And there are many other stories. I mean, a whole load of technology is far better than we are doing right now, because our economies are organized on a capitalistic basis. That makes no sense. It's anarchistic, it is unjust, it is counterproductive, it is predatory, it is speculative, you name it. I mean, how many more things have to go wrong with an economy before people say, okay, folks, we need something else, something radically different. But I'm preaching to the converted, so I shouldn't go on.
Thank you. And yeah, other questions we have. I don't know how much time you have, Radhika, but. Oh,
I'm happy to chat as long as you like, I think.
Yeah, Dr. Kim.
I think there are 2 questions here, yeah.
Yeah.
I wanted to go back to the book, and I wanted to ask, I got a little bit lost in trying to understand the relationship between Department 1 and Department 2, right? The what you call productive consumption and individual consumption. Now, how does either one of them, I mean, in a way, how do they relate to each other in a way of contributing to the total social capital? Kind of simple question.
Well,
you can help me understand that.
That's a good question. So I would say, think of it in a very simple way. Imagine that you are a weaver, right? Now, in the early days of capitalism, you probably put a few sticks together and you made your own loom. But as production develops, you can actually have people who are making weaving looms, right? So now an ordinary consumer is not going to buy a loom, right? They are going to buy cloth. So the weaver produces cloth, and the people who start producing weaving looms are producing the means of production for the weavers. So the weaver is a Department 2 outfit producing goods that are directly consumed by ordinary people. And the people who make the looms are Department 1. They are supplying the producers' goods. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how does that translate into directly into accumulation? I guess I'm just trying to wrap my head around that.
Right. I think, okay, actually that connects up with another question that was asked earlier when Derek was speaking. Where he had that quote about what happens to investment under socialism, right? So essentially what Marx is saying is that, in a very simple economy, in a very simple economy, really, there are very few, maybe I should take 2 steps back. In the early days of classical political economy, when people were trying to think about how value is produced, then they thought basically about, how much of time do I, imagine I'm raising chickens and you are raising pigs. So how much time does it take for me to raise 1 chicken vis-a-vis you raising 1 pig? So we can, depending on how much time it takes, we establish an exchange rate between chickens and pigs, say 4 chickens equals 1 pig or something. It is not because of anything intrinsic to chickens and pigs. It has to do with how much time it takes in a given context to produce the 2 relative to one another, right? So I'm sorry to begin there, but the point is this was very clear to even Adam Smith, right? Where things got difficult is because then you would employ people and in order to produce these things, and therefore you would calculate the total number of hours used to produce something with employees, etc. But then there came a question: what would happen if you introduce machinery in this? So in addition to, say, let's go away from chickens and pigs and say wheat and rice. So once you introduce tractors and harvesters and pumps and so on, how do you calculate how much labor? How does this have anything to do with labor anymore? And this is the problem that Marx solved, that Adam Smith could not solve, Ricardo could not solve, nobody could solve, okay? So the point is that therefore the introduction of capital was very important for Marx, and therefore Marx, and in his time, and therefore Marx is kind of showing that the production of ordinary goods, consumption goods, has a certain logic. And then the same logic can also be transferred to the production of producers' goods, because in the early days when Marx wrote, many producers' goods were produced at very low levels of productivity, with people just banging together machinery on a craft basis. But then you got bigger and bigger machines that actually produce the producers' goods. So he had to theorize this, and that's what he's trying to do, I think. Anyway, I don't know if that makes sense, but there was one other thing I meant to say about this. It'll come back to me later, but I hope that made some sense to you anyway.
Thank you. And maybe if we could, we can take 3 questions, Radhika, and then you can respond as you like.
Sure.
That's okay. Okay, great. So Nick.
Hey, thank you very much for the interesting presentation. It's kind of making me rethink some of my own biases, perhaps against Luxemburg, namely on like her organizational political philosophy rather than her merits of her economics. I will also just say before I make my question that Lukács is also very much aligned with you, Dr. Desai, in terms of his admiration of the accumulation of capital, even though he kind of gets tarred with this Western Marxist sort of position. I think he's like really a lot more Russian and Bolshevik in his orientation. Now, my question is, who kind of makes up this body of Western Marxists, I guess, kind of economic or legal Marxism, as you would call it, that you're kind of in dialogue with? I'm just kind of curious. I mean, you don't have to get too polemical, but if you want to as well, that'd be kind of fun. So anyway, thanks.
Yeah.
And Max?
Yeah, thank you as well for the incredible presentation. It was incredibly informative, just in every respect. I guess had a question specifically about the returning to the need to theorize and organize for democratic centralized planning, and the, I guess, tension, if there is any, between that need and the existing literature, at least that I'm aware of, having to do with the details of modern economic centralized planning, which almost entirely, as far as I'm aware, come from exactly those revisionist Marxist economists who make heavy use of neo-Ricardian methods and Strafe and production of commodities by means of commodities and so forth. So I guess I was wondering, is there anything worthwhile, or is there anything to be gained from those approaches which try to dualize Marxist and neo-Ricardian approaches, or does that entire effort and project need to be scrapped and we need to return to the fundamentals?
Thanks, Max. And Kijana?
Yeah, definitely echo others. I thank you for the presentation. I found it really clarifying and enlightening. And my question, I think, is, so we, in terms of like what the source of, in as much as you can say it has one source, the source of crises in capitalism is there. You know, we talked about how it's not, as like a lot of bourgeois economists will sometimes claim, it's not like a disproportion between departments 1 and 2, but and Marx and Engels are always very clear that it's like a generalized overproduction of commodities. And my question is that, you know, basically, if this, what I'm about to say, you think is correct, what I'm gathering from your presentation and from the discussion today is that that overproduction is overproduction of commodities relative to the demand for them, which is, I've also heard people say like the monetarily effective demand. And is that the same as saying like overproduction relative to money? Because I've heard all these different things from various sources, and I'm not sure if they're equivalent or if you'd agree with all of them. So yeah, is that seem correct to you?
Okay, let me try and do as much justice as you can. So Nick asked, and thanks about the Lukács Luxemburg link. I did not know about it, so I will explore it. So thank you very much. Although I should say that I tend to think of Lukács, I mean, I found him very useful, and one of my favorite sections in history and class consciousness is this section called Antinomies of Bourgeois Thought, which is absolutely brilliant. So don't get me wrong, I think he's great. But I also sometimes wonder if he is not too much of a Weberian rather than in some ways a Marxist, because you see, once you get neoclassical economics, you also get what Weber did, which is Weber was originally trained as an economist, and was he, by creating a separation between economics and sociology, he sort of says that there is this division of labor, academic division of labor, and then anyway, it's a bit complicated, but Lukács is a bit prey to that. But anyway, who makes up the body of Western Marxism? So I would say that there are these Marxist economists that I talked about, okay? So there are them. And you can also be guided by, Perry Anderson's demarcation of Western Marxism more broadly, but I wouldn't necessarily apply my criticism so much to the Lukács or whatever Gramsci's, etc. Although one would have, because partly I have not done the study. What I do know is that contemporary, that is, let's say post-70s Marxism or post-50s, post-war Marxism, has this very strong tendency to, well, there is this, I'm trying to think, how shall I do? Well, okay. Marxist economics goes back, as I say, to Tugan-Baranovsky. So we're talking about a very long-term process. I have no doubt that in important ways, as I've already said, Lenin was influenced by it. Rosa Luxemburg knew about it and was trying to attack it. Bukharin criticized it by calling it a policy of theoretical reconciliation. Hilferding knew about it. I've shown in my writings about Hilferding. So it goes back to that era of which Lukács, Gramsci, all these people we like to read are a part. And I definitely think that there is a sense in which they were these great these older generations were affected by it, but we have not done a full, shall we say, review of it. But then when we get to the post-war period, you definitely get a redoubled attack on Marxism, and that goes hand in hand with the arrival of Marxism in the academy. Okay. And so you get people, as I say, both the Brennerites, the Dobb and Brenner side, and then the Sweezy and Monthly Review side, and they each of them accept the criticism of this, that Marx is suffering from a transformation problem and other associated elements. You know, some people still go on about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. You know, they don't think Marx was wrong about that, but that's a small thing because they still live within a larger universe where Marx has this transformation problem. So this becomes very standard in today's in this time. And then you also get around it the emergence of Marxist sociology, Marxist political science, you know, all these social science disciplines. And like I said earlier, these social science disciplines are built around neoclassical economics. So they accept the truth of what neoclassical, or accept as true what neoclassical economics says about this sphere called the economy. And then they build the rest of their understanding around it. So similarly in Marxism, what Western Marxists say about the economy is accepted, and then you get your Marxist international relations and your Marxist sociology and so on, which then means that all of this accepts the view that's of essentially capitalism as Schumpeterian, as having no contradictions, as having a transformation problem, etc. So this really I find pervasive in all the academic Marxism that I've seen so far, and it is not based on Marx's writing. And often I read things written by people who call themselves Marxists, and I don't know whether they have read anything, like whether they've read Capital, or whether they just parachute in and cherry pick one quote here and another quote there, which happens to suit them. Because the difference is so vast. So just to say, I mean, I will say that, you know, in each case, there is a slightly different combination of things. So to make things easier, what I did in my consumption demand article is I picked an article by Anwar Sheikh to criticize him, not because I dislike Anwar Sheikh. I think he's a great guy in many ways, and I have great admiration for him as many other Western Marxists, because like I said, I would agree with them on most things, but there are things I disagree with, and I'd like to register my disagreement, because it is not right to say that Marx's value analysis does not work. It works perfectly well if they'd only understand what he's trying to do.
And was that because, you know, the sort of material conditions in which they were, where like it was neoclassical economics was dominant, and so, well, let's just try to make Marxism, let's try to explain Marxism through neoclassical economists so we can keep our jobs? Or?
Well, I mean, that would be too crass. Obviously, none of them think that. And I would not accuse them quite of that. But I would say this, that, you know, as I say, going back to the late 19th century, you already had people who were already trained in neoclassical economics. And if once you're trained in that, I don't think it's possible for you to understand what Marx is saying unless you really realize that you have to park that at the door. And the second thing, like I said at the very beginning, you have to understand what a radical break the advent of neoclassical economics is. Look at it this way, and I've said this in print. What is neoclassical economics? It is the distillation of what Marx used to call vulgar economy into a more systematic presentation, a more cleaned up presentation, a more logically coherent presentation. But it is not by that made any more true. So things can be logically coherent and entirely untrue, right? But it appears to be, you know, coherent and so on. So I don't think, so as I say, I don't think anybody is thinking like that. And, you know, I'll share this with you. I mean, I remember talking to somebody who I will not name, but who is a very prominent Marxist economist. And he said, I don't understand value. And I have no doubt he doesn't understand value. He is being perfectly honest. And most people don't, because you see, I remember a friend of mine who is a dear friend, and I have a lot of respect for him, but we once started a Marx reading group. And at the first Marx reading group, he stands up and says, somebody asked, what is commodity fetishism? He stands up and says, it's consumerism. And I said, okay, let's go hang ourselves. I mean, if in fact, in Marx's time, there was hardly any consumerism. People were desperately poor. They needed to consume. How could he possibly have been criticizing consumerism? What is commodity fetishism is actually neoclassical economics. It's actually vulgar economics. If you read that, just sit down and read that section on commodity fetishism or the fetish character of commodities, and you will see what I mean. But because our minds are addled with neoclassical economics, we don't get it, because we don't understand that we really have to park this. We have to get rid of it, and it will take an effort. But once you make that effort, you'll get there. I have no doubt. Because I was also schooled in it. I have to say, it's not like it was easy for me, and no, it wasn't. But I realized at a certain point that he's talking on a completely different level. But you see, what these Marxist economists, this is exactly what they prevent you from doing, because they actually encourage you to think of Marxism in neoclassical economics terms. Think of Marxist analysis in neoclassical economics terms. This is the death blow. Anyway, Max's question was about centralized planning. And something about Ricardo. Max, I'm not sure I totally understood this, but basically what I would say is that Marx's critique of capitalism is here. What you need to do to organize a socialist economy is different. That's also why I said, early on, that actually many of I'm not a pundit on that subject, but it's interesting that neoclassical economics, when it went into the hands of people who were socialists, they said, let's use it to try to create a mechanism of planning with shadow prices and blah, blah, and so on. Oscar Lange and Karl Polanyi was involved with it at one point and so on. So these were interesting debates, because what you need to do to organize a socialist society is the exact opposite of what capitalism is. Capitalism is not planned. It is not there to fulfill your and my needs. It's there to produce value, to accumulate, and the fulfillment of our needs is a byproduct of that, a necessity for value to take a proper use value form that forces it to some extent. But to organize a planned economy, we would need a very different way of thinking. And it would, of course, mean that you no longer had capitalism, that all the agents of production were amenable to planning. They were not, the moment a socialist government is elected, they're not going to try and organize a coup against you, etc. All of these power dynamics become relevant as well, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's what I got. And then Jana said, about disproportion and overproduction and underconsumption. So what I do in that consumption demand article is, I own underconsumption. I wear underconsumption, because underconsumption is used as a bad word. Like you're an underconsumptionist, which means, you are an economic illiterate. But actually, Marx was talking about the paucity of consumption of the masses. They are unable to consume, hence so of course there is an element. So overproduction and underconsumption is saying the glass is half full or it is half empty. It doesn't matter, but it's the same thing, right? So to me, condemning people for being underconsumptionist is to use is to swear when you haven't got a good argument, right? So there is no doubt in my mind that and overproduction is always relative to demand. It cannot be any other way. And, Marx says here and there, what do you mean effective demand? In capitalist society, there is no other demand but effective demand, right? I mean, I may need everything under the sun, but unless I have, if I don't have a penny, I cannot get any of it, right? So need has nothing to do with it. It's and then finally, you said something about money. I also just wanted to say one last thing, and I would love to talk about this once I've written some more things, but I have written a few things about this. All these Marxist economists also say one other thing which drives me up the wall, because it is patently untrue, even if you just read the chapter on money in volume 1, which I presume that you have. They say that Marx has a commodity theory of money. Like if Marx has a commodity theory of money, throw out capital, throw out everything, because he's not worth reading. Because it is not possible to have commodity money. In fact, money is precisely that which is not a commodity. What Marx is trying to say in Capital is that, and also remember, money is an ancient social institution. Money pre-exists capitalism. Money has existed for a very long time. We know, these days, what is the cutting edge of our knowledge of money is that there was money in the ancient Near East, what we call Babylon and so on, where people kept clay tablets to show who owed what to whom, etc. There was always money. So then, what is it with capitalism and money? That's what we have to figure out. And what I would like to argue, and I have begun to argue, is that capitalism takes this ancient social institution, but it then wants it to behave in certain ways, which is not natural to it. And also, capitalism makes contradictory demands on the monetary system. In fact, in a certain sense, it's imagined that if capitalism were a person and they were trying to speak, but they ended up learning a language they didn't fully understand, what would it look like? So that's what it is, because capitalism's essence is value, and value can only be expressed in money. But in order to express value in money, it has to take this system, which is not its own, and try to adapt it so that it may somehow express value in money in a reasonably proper way. So all they then do is they try to bang money into shape. So for example, right now, all the Western economies are looking at tightening interest rates, because basically they have no other way of forcing money to retain its value than to periodically put a stop to production by decreasing money supply, by increasing interest rates, essentially to induce a recession, as happened in the early 1980s, or as happened in the Great Depression, etc. So these are some of the ways that, so there are many other elements to this, but this is just to give you one example, that it has no other way of dealing with inflation than the hammer of high interest rates. But the hammer of high interest rates hurts a lot else other than, because doing anything else would be to use the monetary and financial system to plan production. And that it will not do, because the moment it does that, it puts the very existence of capitalism into question. This is the issue. So
thank you so much. So we are going to be ending shortly, and this is our last meeting. So I have just a couple of housekeeping things to do before we leave, but thank you so much, Radhika, for coming.
Well, thank you, folks. I really enjoyed talking, and I hope to see you again sometime. And hopefully you may come to some of our International Manifesto Group events. If you are interested, just sign up and put your name down. And you don't have to, of course, we love it if you sign the manifesto, but you can just sign up and ask to receive our communications as well. So lovely to see you, and thanks a ton. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.